My name is Anna Aulinger, and I'm part of the gender team at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and the United Nations Office in Vienna. And I'm very, very happy to guide you through the session and to welcome you in the audience, as well as our guests, which I introduce in a minute. Before we start, just some words on the housekeeping. I'm sure you're all very experienced with joining webinars, but please note that this session will be recorded and we will also share it later on our website. And also please note that this event is observing the code of conduct to prevent harassment at UN system events so that everyone can enjoy an inclusive and respectful environment. I'm supported in the background by my colleagues Magdalena Hauland and Elena Pohl, who also helped organizing this event. And when you check your calendars, you might notice that we are celebrating International Women's Day a bit early. It's only Friday, the 4th of March, and as you all know, the day itself takes place next week at the 8th of March. But this year, the Vienna-based UN organizations have hosted different spotlight sessions every day during this week to leading up to the day as such. And here we explored the links between women's rights and the climate crisis, as well as the respective mandated areas that we work at. And this year's theme is Gender Equality Today for a Sustainable Tomorrow. For example, there were sessions on minimizing the disproportionate impact of nuclear tests on women or on gender-responsive sustainable energy transition. And in case you're interested in still watching these sessions, they were all recorded and we will also share them on our website that was already shared in the chat. And to set the tone for this session, I would like to share a video with you by UN Women. Please, Magda.
Earth, our only home. Invaluable, but not invulnerable. Are we too late to save it? Climate change is making our world more dangerous, more fragile, more unequal. In these uncertain times, women and girls face a disproportionate threat of displacement, poverty, and violence. But women and girls are also a powerful force in climate action. As innovators in green energy, as defenders of the environment, and as educators of our generation and the next. Gender equality is not just a woman's issue. It's the path to our survival. So it's not too late to invest in climate action by and for women. Not too late to empower women entrepreneurs and decision makers at home. Not too late to give voice and power to this next generation of Earth's champions. It's not too late to demand commitments to build an equal and enduring future for all. Championing climate action by and for women and girls is the key to saving our planet. Join the fight for gender equality today, so that together we can create a sustainable tomorrow. It's not too late.
Thank you very much for showing the video. Yeah, as you saw, addressed in the video, the climate crisis has severe and lasting impacts on our environment and our economic and social development. And these impacts are not felt equally by all members of society. The most vulnerable experience the deepest impacts of the climate crisis, such as natural hazards like droughts or hurricanes. And this is actually where gender comes into play. Since women constitute the majority of the world's poor and are more dependent on natural resources, they are more vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis than men. And across the world, women depend more on, yet have less access to natural resources, and they often bear a disproportionate responsibility for securing food, water, and fuel. But today's event is not only about raising awareness for these vulnerabilities, We also want to recognize the contribution of women and girls around the world who are leading the charge in building a more sustainable future for all. So how do we achieve climate justice and gender equality? Since the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime is committed to make the world safer from drugs, organized crime, corruption, and terrorism, our mandated areas offer different approaches to tackle the issue. And in this spotlight session, we will focus on some of our areas and look at the relation between gender, the climate crisis, trafficking in persons, wildlife crime, and alternative development. And without further ado, please allow me to introduce today's speakers, which I also invite to turn on their cameras. Ms. Shawan Mulali is a professor of human rights law and director of the Irish Centre for Human Rights at the School of Law at National University of Ireland, Galway. And in 2020, Ms. Mulali was appointed the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Person with a focus on women and girls. Ms. Mulali, thank you so much for joining us. The next speaker on the panel that I would like to introduce is Ms. Jenna Dawson-Faber. She's a program officer for the Global Program for Combating Wildlife and Forest Crime at UNODC, and she can help us explore the link between preventing and addressing crime that affect the environment. Thank you for joining us. And our third speaker is Ms. Anuba Sood. She is officer in charge at the UNODC country office in Afghanistan, and she works on drug prevention and alternative development projects. And she will show us how sustainable environment-friendly options are promoted in her work. Thank you so much for joining us today. So, dear participants in the audience, I will now go through a round of questions for our panelists, but then we also offer you to ask questions by using the chat function. And we will begin with Ms. Mulali. Could you please give us a short overview of how your area of work intersects with gender and the climate crisis?
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to participate in the Spotlight session and to highlight the particular theme of trafficking in persons, in particular women and girls, and the links with climate change and sustainable development. So I'm really happy to have this opportunity to talk about this and to hear from you as well about the work that is ongoing. The links between climate change, disaster settings and risk reduction is a key priority for my work for this year. It will be the subject of my thematic report to the UN General Assembly, and that is an opportunity to highlight key policy recommendations, recommendations for legal change and for advocacy, recognising these links and analysing the links. I do think we are beginning to see more recognition of these links, including in the hosting of today's session and these ongoing conversations, also in the upcoming Commission on the Status of Women meeting, which starts shortly. But I think we need much more analysis and a stronger evidence base to really see how we can ensure that those who are working in environmental settings to combat environmental degradation, to address the climate crisis, who are at the forefront of activism in those settings, are also looking at the questions around the human rights of possible victims of trafficking and how to be effective in preventing trafficking in persons that may arise in these contexts. And so in my work, what I've been trying to highlight are the gaps that we see in capacity and knowledge and responses in humanitarian settings, among humanitarian actors, among those involved in disaster risk reduction, and those working in conflict situations. Because we know that the effects of climate change can be slow, they can be onset over a period of time, or they can be sudden and give rise to a sudden crisis situations. And both of those contexts can also increase risks of trafficking in persons, especially women and girls. Why? Through increased risks of displacement internally or across borders, through the loss of livelihoods leading to poverty, which of course we know leads to risks of exploitation, including trafficking, and through increasing situations of insecurity, possibly contributing to conflict, again, which can be a setting in which we see increased risks of trafficking. And although there is increasing attention to migration and displacement linked to climate change, there is still considerable uncertainty around the status and rights to be given to persons who are displaced as a result of climate change. And that uncertainty around status and rights, of course, contributes to risks of exploitation, including trafficking in persons. And that can be for persons who are internally displaced or persons displaced across borders. And as Anne already said in the opening, we also know that women face discrimination globally in terms of ownership of property, control over natural resources, ownership of land, and so have less control over the mitigating steps needed to combat climate change and environmental degradation, and are also at greater risk of loss of livelihoods in those contexts. And just very briefly, the second link I think that we need to emphasize is that those sectors that are contributing significantly to climate change and environmental degradation, intensive agriculture, extractive mining, some textile industries, fisheries, intensive fisheries, are also those sectors in which we see a high incidence of trafficking for forced labour and risks of trafficking for forced labour. So we need to ensure that in combating environmental degradation and climate change, that we are also addressing those risks and recognizing the links, and thereby contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals and to sustainable development, which will address the intersections of both. And linked to that, my final point is just that often those persons who are most at risk of trafficking and who are also significantly affected by climate change are women and girls among minority communities, Indigenous peoples, those who are at heightened risk of poverty, and women and girls with disabilities. So we need to recognise the intersections of discrimination, racial justice, and inclusive responses that are needed to combat both climate change and to address the human rights of victims of trafficking, and most importantly, to prevent trafficking in persons. So those are the key themes that I'm trying to address and to bring forward recommendations on this year to the General Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you so much for highlighting the intersections between human trafficking, the climate crisis and gender, but also how intersectionality is important and looking at those that are most concerned. We go now to our colleague, Ms. Dawson Faber. Could you please also highlight how gender climate plays a role in your work and how you address it?
Thanks so much, Anne, and what a privilege to come after Ms. Mullally as well, because I think I'd like to pick up on some of the things that she mentioned as well. So maybe just a very quick start on what the Global Program for Combating Wildlife and Forest Crime does. We're a little bit broader than just the name in our title. Over the last few years, we've really been broadening our scope to work a little bit more on other crimes that affect the environment, going beyond sort of the wildlife and forest elements, to look also at crimes in the fisheries sector, crimes in the illegal mining and minerals trafficking and waste trafficking sectors as well. Because I think there's a growing understanding that really these crimes do affect biodiversity and climate change, in addition to the fact that they really do undermine good governance, socioeconomic development, health, as we're now experiencing with the global pandemic. And in many countries that already have fairly fragile contexts from a security perspective, many of these countries are also fragile from a climate perspective. And from our global program side, I mean, we see it as an opportunity to harness a virtual circle, if you will, so sort of protect biodiversity and prevent illegal exploitation of natural resources, which in turn will hopefully lead to more sustainable livelihoods and a healthy global commons for all of us. So the work that we do is very much targeted at the member states to help them strengthen their criminal justice systems to better prevent and respond to these crimes as part of a more holistic approach to address one of the factors, crime, that is undermining our ability to reach the SDGs and achieve Agenda 2030. I wanted to think a little bit about what Ms. Mulali was talking about in terms of the intersectionality of so many of these issues. And just as she mentioned that human trafficking and illegal exploitation of natural resources do go hand in hand, we also see this across the spectrum. We're starting to see a lot more convergence of these types of crimes with one another, not only on the environmental goods side. So you'll see the trafficking of ivory and pangolin scales in the same shipments, but we're starting to see a lot more about the illegal exploitation of labor on fishing vessels, for example, in the mining sector, as she mentioned. And these are areas where UNODC has the opportunity to bring its collective expertise to bear and to support countries as they work towards this. I thought I might actually mention a really interesting project that we're working on that has a fairly strong gender component because we're working with Cameroon, Chad, and Gabon on the tri-border area where there's a lot of wilderness areas and parks that have been targeted for the illegal wildlife trade and other illegal exploitation of natural resources. We've got a really fun project that we're working on together with UNESCO under the Peace Building Fund. We're working with about 1,800 youth to build a cross-border network of youth as agents of change, not only for the sort of crime and conflict prevention side of things, but we're building like green social entrepreneurship opportunities together with them to provide alternative sources of income so that they don't have to be reliant on the illegal economy. And this element has a very strong gender component because it's a recognized fact that women and girls are disproportionately affected by these crimes, and the roles that they play in prevention are really critical for us to understand more. Back over to you, Anne.
Thank you so much for giving us this insight into your work and the diverse aspects that you address. And you actually already gave us the keyword to get over to Ms. Anuba Sood, alternative development. This is one area where you work at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime Office in Afghanistan. So please also share some aspects of your work and how they interact with gender and climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm just building upon what Ms. Mulali said and Jenna said. You know, when gender inequality is high, forest depletion is high, air pollution is high, other measures of environment degradation are high, so is drug cultivation high. And the women's involvement in the drug use and drug trade is very high. And we are seeing that very much in Afghanistan context where I'm working. We're trying to address that through alternative development rather than just eradication of crops and introduction of drugs, providing alternative socio-economic projects that would involve the whole community and especially women. Because if women make a decision to cultivate a licit crop, the whole family benefits from it. And we've seen it in our projects that we are running in the country. Poultry is very famous. Greenhouses have been adapted very much. Backyard gardening is adapted very much. And as Ms. Mulali said, you know, women's control and access to land and other resources minimal is so the decision making is very less. Whereas when it comes to projects like this, they can be done in the backyard. You don't need to own a huge plot of land to do that. And we started some of these projects, which were very, very small of household level across many provinces and districts in the country. And we saw over a period of a year or two, they were getting substantial income from these projects, up from, starting with nothing to almost $200 every 3 months. And slowly these projects started expanded. So the households pool the poultry, the chicken and the eggs together, formed a selling point, identified a shop where they could supply in bulk, have a better bargaining power and edge in the market to get a better price and negotiate that with the middlemen. Similarly, for vegetables coming out of the greenhouses, from backyard gardens, not just increase their food security, but also their access to the market. And slowly, the household members, especially the youngsters and the youth, started getting involved, who were otherwise going to the opium fields to work. But now there was enough work being generated through these projects at household level for them to get involved. And thereafter, therefore, reducing the drug usage rate in the communities. So I very much believe, absolutely intersectionality of gender, how livelihoods cut across through this. Of course, there are many studies which show that, direct economic activity doesn't lead to any, positive effects. But if you look at holistically involving the entire household and the community, it does make a difference. It does change the fabric of that community. And we've seen that through our work in Afghanistan and also other contexts that I have worked in. I would just like to end with a quote by a famous environment activist, Tabanna Shiva, that we're either going to have a future where women lead the way to make peace with the earth, or we are not going to have a human future at all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anuba Sood, for this very inspiring quote at the end and giving us such a good insight into your work and all the interconnectedness of so many aspects. Yeah, we asked the audience to also ask questions in the chat, and we actually got one. And maybe that since Ms. Mulali already addressed the human rights aspects in your upcoming report, maybe that's something you want to elaborate on. If climate migrants are protected by law, or if there's any kind of regulation that recognizes migrants or migration due to climate change.
Thank you very much for this question. And I think this is hugely important because mobility and migration is being seen as part of the adaptation strategies to climate change and environmental degradation. And of course, it can be a positive thing for people in terms of opening up new opportunities, particularly often for women and girls, and through the sending of remittances for those who remain at home. However, the key problem and what is raised in this question is there a pathway for safe and regular migration? Is there certainty around the status of those who are displaced from their homes because of climate change and environmental degradation and are displaced across borders? And that is something that has been addressed in the discussions and negotiations linked to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change since the Cancun meeting in 2010. Human mobility is now a key part of those discussions and negotiations and is seen as part of the adaptation strategy. But as I said, we still don't have an agreement on the status of those who are climate migrants displaced across borders. Because as we know, under international law, the definition of a refugee who qualifies as a refugee is relatively narrow, linked to specific grounds and forms of persecution. And so a person, although we use terms like climate migrants or climate refugees in terms of the legal status, there is a significant gap. And many small island developing states, for example, have been calling for this gap to be addressed. And in terms of my office and my mandate, regular migration, safe migration, secure status and rights of residence, that is critical to meaningful prevention action to combating trafficking in persons. So it continues to be a gap. It is something that is a policy priority for a number of UN agencies, for the Disaster Displacement Panel, for those who are looking at these issues. And the upcoming International Migration Review Forum in May, which looks at progress on implementing and achieving the objectives of the Global Compact in migration, that will be a key moment to try to address these issues again, because the Global Compact on migration does include specific references to climate change, to environmental degradation, to disasters. So Objective 2, for example, which talks about addressing drivers of migration has these explicit references to the need to develop adaptation and resilience strategies, and to address the vulnerabilities of persons who are affected by disasters. And that must include looking at expanding safe, regular migration pathways to avoid these uncertainties, to avoid pushing people into precarious situations where they will be and are currently vulnerable to exploitation because of our failures of policy and law in responding. So it is a matter that is being discussed and is recognised, but as yet we don't have clear legal frameworks that allow for secure migration status and migration pathways linked to climate change and environmental degradation. So thank you for that question. I think it's very important that we address that in recommendations for policy, for law reform, and for coordination in responding to these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comprehensive answer. If there's no other question in the chat, then I would actually move on to Ms. Dawson-Faber and ask about the role that data plays in your work.
Well, thanks for the question, Anne, actually, because I think it picks up quite a lot on what Ms. Mullally talked about at the very beginning about the importance of developing an evidence base. And, you know, from our side, making an impact on preventing and addressing crimes that affect the environment is really quite difficult to do without a better understanding of the role that gender plays in these crimes. And to not understand and consider the diversity of the stakeholders that are involved in these crimes throughout the criminal justice chain, you know, from offenders to victims to influencers, supporters, beneficiaries, and then on the other side, the solution makers. I mean, it does us really a great disservice when we're trying to develop a targeted, meaningful program of support to prevent and address these crimes. And a couple of years ago, we realized that there is surprisingly little data on the role of gender and crimes that affect the environment. And there are no consistent indicators available to identify trends, let alone to actually mainstream or support decision-making in this area. So together with our colleagues in the research branch here at UNODC, we're actually looking to build on this lack of data that exists on this topic. And we're specifically looking at the role of women in wildlife trafficking. We're starting with some of the hotspots in Latin America. We want to identify the roles that women play in the wildlife trafficking chain, not only to better strengthen the actions against wildlife crime, but to harness their skills and their knowledge and hopefully empower them to take action to prevent these crimes. And I mean, just maybe an example of some of the questions that we're thinking about asking to give you a sense of what data isn't out there is, how are women involved in wildlife crime compared to men? What roles do they play? How are they recruited, if they are recruited into these positions? Are there gender-specific patterns for who does what along the trafficking chain? And if so, are women chosen for particular roles and for what reasons? And, on the other side of this is, what specific skill sets do women have in the prevention and solutions arena? And how can we develop enforcement efforts to adapt to account for these kind of gender differences? And I mean, I think putting this kind of request in and search for data in context it's going to be fantastic to have this information because it's just not out there. There are a handful of brilliant academics who are doing some work on this in Africa and in Mexico, and we work very closely with them to try to build this sort of database, and we're doing some field work right now. But I think, we also have to situate the information that we're going to glean from this research in this sort of broader understanding of like the gender dimensions of, power, access, earning, investment opportunities in which women operate to be able to better understand why they're involved in these crimes and what kind of incentives there may be for them to participate or to opt out of these kind of opportunities. So I think just to sort of put it out there that this is a really large gap in the understanding of the entire context of all sorts of crimes that affect the environment. And we're starting on this very, very small path that we hope that will generate some good information that we can build on and try to replicate understanding in the different geographic and contexts that we're working within. Back to you.
Thank you so much for enlightening us on the unfortunate gap in research and in data. Let's move to Ms. Sood, and maybe you could present us a best practice example or an example from your work which illustrate maybe girls and women as agents of change.
Sure. Like I said, some of these projects are very much at the household level. And we soon realize that, one thing leads to the other. For instance, if you're starting, starting work on a small plot of land where opium poppy or illicit crops were being grown, and you sort of sensitize the community to grow illicit crops, talking about the benefits and how it's not just about income, but also about the health and their vulnerability to the drug lords or insurgents in the country. We soon realize that this cannot be done in isolation. This involves, making the soil more, enriched with nutrients. That will involve keeping livestock, using the livestock manure to enrich the soil. So therefore, more and more members of the family started getting involved in these processes. And that meant youth and young ones at household level, because most men were out going in the fields to work or were not there. These were women-headed households. And then, what the livestock was giving, whether it was milk or eggs, that needed a market, that needed a support. So that needed a unit, where you could preserve. Maybe I'll take an example of a dairy value chain. Then you needed a chilling plant to chill the milk, a processing plant to increase the shelf life, and then packaging and then branding. And that's where we started involving the youth as agents of change. And, soon the income coming from that was almost equivalent to what they were getting from opium poppy. And in some cases, even more and more sustainable and more acceptable without the fear of government or other sources coming and destroying those fields. Now, these were legal income sources. And also, I want to add a drug angle, drug center angle to it. More women started getting involved in these sort of activities. They were more keen and open to going for treatment. But then the accessibility is an issue. The centers are either far, even if they make it, the staff there is male, and some cultural, it's not comfortable to, have an opposite sex medical practitioner treating. So these kind of impediments started coming in. And that's where I feel we need to step in to make the treatment more accessible, more gender sensitive, evidence-based, that caters to the needs of all age groups and all genders. So one thing led to the other. Nothing could be done in isolation. And this is what has been going on, and more we are expanding. And also now we are seeing, the role women play influencing the decision as to what crop to cultivate when the season comes. And they participate then with the evidence or, tangible income that is there. And that helps them influence those decisions, not just at the family level, but also at the community level, because now these households and women have got together and formed cooperatives or groups, what we call community development centers, where these decisions can be taken. And one household looks at the other and they see the change that has happened in their life, not in terms of just income, but, health, the way they're spending the income. If women are more involved, they are the ones taking the decision as the way that income should go. And for women, the health of the family, education of the children comes foremost than other things. So this is something, we've been seeing through our work.
Thank you so much for giving us this insight in your work. And I think it has been an insight not many people were able to get before, so really appreciate it. This event is called a Spotlight Session because we only shine a spotlight at this moment on your important work. Ms. Jenna Dawson-Faber already shared more resources, and you're invited to do so as well. Thank you so much for your interesting inputs to shine the light on the human rights situation of climate migrants, to look at aspects of intersectionality, to shine the light on the lack of sex disaggregated data, and also how alternative development projects actually can lead to change and make women and girls also change makers in addressing their livelihood situations of themselves, the family, but also helping setting sustainable environmental projects. So we definitely know that we have to include half of the world's population to find solutions for a sustainable planet and also for a gender equal world. And as I said at the beginning, this is just one spotlight session of several that took place this week, offered by the Vienna-based UN organizations. And what we discussed today will be part of an outcome document where we share the main insights that we learned from all of the sessions. And we share this document also on our website, which was already shared in the chat. And at the 8th of March itself, there will also be a UN Women event that you're also invited to join. We will also share the link in the chat. And for now, I wish you all a good upcoming International Women's Day. I thank you so much. And I also wish you a restful weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Nice to meet you too.
Bye.